For over 2 centuries, the border between Canada and the United States has been called the friendliest in the world. But history tells a different story. This isn't a tale of peace and cooperation, it's the untold history of how close Canada came to becoming American. In 1775, before the United States was even a country, the Continental Army decided to invade Canada. The plan came straight from George Washington's War Council: march north, capture Quebec, and convince Canadians to join the revolution. Two generals led the charge, Benedict Arnold and Richard Montgomery, believing they'd be greeted as liberators. They were wrong. The locals didn't see freedom. They saw foreigners marching through snow with muskets. As the Americans stormed Quebec City on New Year's Eve, their gunpowder froze solid in the winter air. Montgomery was killed instantly by cannon fire, Arnold was shot through the leg, and the rest of the army scattered. The battle ended before midnight. For a few brief weeks, the United States technically controlled Montreal, the only time in history America has occupied Canadian soil. But their victory meant nothing. The local militia turned on them, the British regrouped, and the invasion collapsed. A year later, Benjamin Franklin tried diplomacy instead. He traveled north to persuade Canada to join the new union, offering protection and partnership. Every province refused. They didn't want to trade one empire for another. By 1776, the dream of American Canada was dead, buried in snow outside the walls of Quebec. But the idea didn't stay buried. Half a century later, Washington was watching north again. By the 1840s, American newspapers were printing bold headlines about Manifest Destiny, the belief that the United States was meant to control all of North America. The slogan wasn't just about the West, it included the North too. Politicians began calling Canada unfinished business. Editorials in the New York Herald and Philadelphia Ledger openly discussed absorbing Canada peacefully through commerce and common destiny. Then came the leak that made it official. In 1849, a document known as the Continental Union Manifesto appeared in Washington. It proposed annexing Canada without war through trade, migration, and shared defense. Lawmakers described it as friendly unification. Canadians called it something else: an invasion without bullets. Behind the speeches, American investors were already making moves. Wealthy businessmen started buying Canadian timber companies, mining operations, and banks, slowly pushing American ownership north of the border. The goal was simple: control the economy first, then the flag. And then came a bizarre chapter: the Fenian Raids. In 1866, thousands of Irish-American veterans from the US Civil War crossed into Ontario with rifles and battle flags. They were called the Fenians, and they had a wild plan: capture Canada and trade it to Britain in exchange for Irish independence. Washington pretended not to notice, secretly funding some of their supply lines. The attacks failed miserably, but they terrified both Ottawa and London. For the first time since 1812, Canada realized the US might not need a war to take them. They could just let chaos spill across the border. That fear peaked in 1867, when Britain faced crushing post-war debts. Behind closed doors, some in Parliament floated a shocking idea: selling off parts of Rupert's Land, the vast territory that would become Manitoba and Saskatchewan, to the United States. American diplomats were quietly approached about the deal, and maps were drafted showing new borders that stretched all the way to Hudson Bay. The US was interested. They had just bought Alaska from Russia that same year, and the thought of controlling both coasts set off alarms in London. British newspapers caught wind of the talks and went ballistic. The Times of London warned that selling Canadian territory would create a second American empire. Public backlash killed the plan, but by then the damage was done. Britain had exposed just how fragile its control over the northern colonies really was. In a panic, the British government rushed to create something new: a semi-independent federation called the Dominion of Canada. It was born not out of celebration, but fear. Canada's confederation in 1867 wasn't just a political milestone, it was a defense mechanism, a way to keep the US from swallowing the territory whole. The timing wasn't a coincidence. Alaska's purchase had surrounded Canada from both sides. Creating the Dominion was London's emergency firewall. The strangest part? Canada had drawn up its own version, a mirror strategy called Defense Scheme Number 1, secretly written by a general named James Buster Sutherland Brown in the 1920s. His plan was to preemptively invade the US before they could invade first. He even had soldiers train for raids across the border into Montana and North Dakota. Both nations spent years planning wars against each other, and neither one told the other about it. In hindsight, every generation of leaders from Franklin to Roosevelt flirted with the same question: should Canada stay a neighbor or become a possession? The battles, the manifestos, and even the paperwork all pointed the same way. Canada's independence didn't come from distance, it came from surviving a century of near absorption. And if history had turned even slightly differently, the maple leaf might have been replaced long ago by stars and stripes. By 1958, the Cold War had made paranoia a national policy. Soviet bombers could cross the Arctic in hours, and the United States wanted a continental shield that stretched beyond its own borders. The result was NORAD, the North American Aerospace Defense Command, signed in Colorado Springs by Canada and the US. It merged radar networks and fighter response systems under one structure. What most Canadians didn't know was that the Pentagon wanted to go much further. Internal memos declassified decades later revealed that American defense planners proposed merging command authority itself, meaning Canada's military would no longer act independently. Prime Minister John Diefenbaker was briefed on the idea in 1959. He reportedly told his cabinet that a joint command becomes a single master. He refused the proposal outright, warning that once control crossed the border, it would never return. The US wasn't pleased. By 1960, leaked Pentagon communications described Canada not as an ally, but as a convenient extension of continental defense. They referred to its airspace as a northern platform for American response. Washington viewed sovereignty as an obstacle to efficiency. The United States continued pressing for deeper integration through technical adjustments. Each one chipped away at command autonomy. The radar lines across the Arctic were built with American funds and maintained by American crews. Canada's defense minister was promised equal say in NORAD operations, but when Canadian officers later tried to override orders during exercises, they were told final command rested in Colorado. In theory, NORAD was a partnership. In practice, it was command by invitation. Had Diefenbaker accepted the original US plan, Canada's military chain of command would have fallen directly under the Pentagon. NORAD would have been the first step toward a political merger disguised as defense coordination. The Prime Minister's refusal created friction with Washington for years. It cost him American support during the 1963 election and left him branded as difficult in US intelligence files. But his decision may have been the last line between alliance and annexation. 3 decades later, the same power struggle moved from runways to boardrooms. In 1988, Canada held one of the most divisive elections in its history over the proposed Canada-US Free Trade Agreement. The final vote margin was razor thin, less than 1%. The deal passed, but only just. Critics warned it would turn Ottawa into Washington North. Supporters promised prosperity through open markets. What it really did was tie both nations' economies into one continuous system where American corporations held the leverage. Within a decade, US energy giants controlled large chunks of Alberta's oil production. American telecoms bought up major Canadian networks. Financial data began routing through US-based servers for efficiency. By 1994, NAFTA expanded the agreement into a continental framework. The historian Mel Hertig called it annexation through paperwork. He wasn't exaggerating. The fine print allowed Washington to impose retaliatory tariffs or rewrite trade rules if Canada didn't comply with economic directives. By the time those plans faded, a quieter form of takeover was already complete. By 2020, nearly 75% of Canada's exports went directly to the United States. Every economic downturn in Washington hit Ottawa within weeks. Canadian policies began aligning automatically with US interests, not through force, but gravity. Cultural and corporate dominance sealed the rest. Hollywood owned the entertainment industry, Silicon Valley owned digital infrastructure. Netflix, Disney, and Meta dictated media standards more than any domestic regulator. Wall Street banks underwrote most major Canadian investment projects. Even defense was layered under US systems. NORAD, still headquartered in Colorado Springs, continued to handle continental surveillance, using satellites and radar grids entirely controlled by American agencies. Canada's military relies on data streams routed through the same Pentagon-operated networks Diefenbaker once feared. The irony is brutal. The system he resisted in 1959 now exists by necessity. Ottawa has to ask permission to access its own defense telemetry. Culturally, the border has nearly dissolved. Surveys show over 60% of Canadians consume more American news than domestic broadcasts. Presidential elections in the US generate more media coverage in Canada than their own federal campaigns. American slang, politics, and media personalities dominate public conversation. When Pew Research compared cross-border media exposure in 2021, Canadians ranked highest in the world for daily consumption of foreign US content. What began as military cooperation became economic interdependence, and then cultural absorption. NORAD's command systems, free trade's fine print, and the quiet influence of American corporations all pointed toward one reality. The United States no longer needed to annex Canada by force. It already controlled the markets, the message, and the machinery that mattered. By the 21st century, the border that armies once fought over became symbolic, a line defended in words, not in structure. Washington's longest dream had changed form. Conquest didn't look like invasion anymore. It looked like partnership on paper, policy in practice, and dependency by design.